When Tim Bergling, known worldwide as Avicii, died in Oman in 2018, the world held its breath. Shocking news that left almost no one unmoved. The narrative that quickly took hold was clear: a sensitive artist, pressured for years by a system that constantly demanded more. At the center of this narrative stood one person in particular, his manager. But years later, this very portrayal has become the subject of a court case. At the end of 2025, his former manager Pournouri, also known as Ash, filed a lawsuit against Avicii's estate. His allegation, the documentary True Stories, as well as several books, had painted a distorted picture of his role and indirectly held him responsible for Tim's condition and death. In March 2026, the lawsuit was dismissed. In the course of these proceedings, however, a large amount of internal documents became public, including emails, messages, and chat logs from the time of their collaboration. Material that wasn't interpreted in hindsight, but comes directly from the situations at the time. And these very documents paint a much more complex picture in many respects than the public narrative long suggested. This video is not trying to rewrite history. It's also not trying to defend or accuse anyone. It's doing something else. It places the known narrative alongside what is actually documented and sees where they align and where they don't. The difference between a narrative and a document is simple. A narrative can change, a document remains. To put the new information into context, it's worth taking a quick look back. The story that most people know doesn't begin with a conflict. It begins with a meteoric rise. Within a few years, a young producer becomes one of the most successful DJs in the world. Small gigs turn into international festivals. Individual songs become global hits. With success, the workload grows. More shows, more travel, fewer breaks. At the same time, Tim is often described as rather introverted, as someone who doesn't always feel comfortable in large social situations. In the documentary Avicii True Stories, he himself talks about how he struggled with severe anxiety related to performing. He describes how alcohol was initially a way for him to reduce this tension, to feel calmer and more confident before shows. Over time, this apparently became a permanent part of his daily life on tour, something that was closely linked to the performances. And it's precisely this use of alcohol that later becomes a central theme, and among other things, in connection with the decision to take a break and seek treatment. At some point, the first problems appear, physically and mentally, from tour to tour. From performance to performance, it gets harder. Anxiety, persistent pain, and overwhelming exhaustion. Finally, he makes a decision. He wants to stop. But this is exactly where the part of the story begins that is most heavily debated to this day. Because at this point, many obligations already exist: contracts, planned shows, entire tours. And from this situation, an impression arises that later takes hold, that he should continue despite this decision. And that those around him didn't just let him quit. In this narrative, another point is often included: that the relationship between Tim and his manager Ash increasingly deteriorated, that tensions arose, and that the collaboration was finally ended. This is often interpreted as if the two had a falling out, and as if Tim had consciously distanced himself from him. Scenes from Avicii True Stories especially help to contribute to this image, with moments in which Tim is visibly and clearly exhausted, and at the same time talks about how difficult it is for him to just stop. Over the years, a clear narrative emerges from this. An artist who couldn't go on anymore. And a system that didn't stop in time. This story is understandable. It's based on real moments and it explains a lot. But it's not the only perspective. Because if you look at what was actually documented in those situations back then, a much more complex picture emerges. After the first breakthrough, the performances piled up at an alarming pace. Hundreds of shows in just 1 year. For someone who is actually rather withdrawn, it starts to take its toll. Tim himself describes that at first, he was even afraid to drink before performances. He was afraid of losing control. In the beginning, I was too afraid to drink before shows because I thought I might screw it up. But I realized that I was too tense, so I started having a few drinks before going on. I saw other DJs drinking, and they'd been doing that for 10 years at every show. So he starts drinking before shows. Not much, just a few drinks. And it works. At least in the beginning. What starts as a help slowly becomes a habit. And then something changes. During a tour, he suddenly gets severe pain. So severe that he's taken to the hospital right after landing. There he is diagnosed with pancreatitis. The doctors tell him clearly that he cannot perform. But even in this state, he asks if he can continue the tour. For the world's most in-demand DJ, the pace doesn't slow down. The pain remains. And to cope with it, he gets medication, lots of medication. I was taking 20 pills a day, but they kept telling me that they weren't addictive. I was still anxious, and then I started touring again. But the pain remains, the anxiety remains, and right here, a cycle begins. Alcohol for the anxiety, medication for the pain, and both reinforce each other. From the outside, you see the success. From the inside, it gets harder and harder to stay in control. And it's exactly in this state that the documents begin. Not in hindsight, not as a narrative, but in the moment as it's all happening. Emails, messages, internal coordination. And they don't show a single event, but a pattern that runs through many of these messages. Tim is often unreachable. In hindsight, headlines express strong criticism of the management. Avicii was supposedly forced to continue despite his condition. But when you look at the internal messages, a more nuanced picture emerges. In one of the key emails from Ash to Tim's father Klas in early 2015, it's clear that no one is really in control anymore. Because Tim's condition has deteriorated massively over the years, which has led to countless shows already having to be cancelled. Internally, chaos has broken out. Hello, Klas. I feel like I have to respond to this, but there's no simple answer, and I also need to express how I feel in all of this. It's not about me complaining about how often I've put my family and my team under stress to put out fires caused by Tim. It's also not just about the fact that I had to work during the time I really should have spent with my family to keep on rescuing Tim from situations he managed to get himself into one way or another. It's also not about the fact that all of this in turn led to numerous conflicts with my wife because I put my work before my family, which has given me a permanent guilty conscience towards my children, and with it constant stress, the bad mood and frustration that such negative stress brings with it. It's also not about Tim putting me in other situations that have caused me financial damage and led to me being perceived as unreliable and unable to keep my word to third parties. For instance, it is clear that it naturally affects not only my own mental state and my inner peace, but also, in fact, my company and my own career. It's also not about the fact that partners, concert promoters, sponsors, and record labels were repeatedly let down by Tim. And they've put us in a situation where a large part of our time and travel consists of managing them in Tim's absence, to keep them motivated and to convince them to keep believing in the project. It's really also not about the fact that over the last 6 to 7 years, I've given up my own dreams, my free time, and my family to invest all my time. And more than that, into building up Tim's career as an artist. It's also not about the fact that during this time, I was faced with challenges I could never have imagined, in the form of financial insecurity and an endless amount of time I spent just keeping the organization around Tim alive, while you withheld my income for over 14 months. Perhaps it's more about the fact that a large part of my daily life over the last 18 months has consisted of losing my control. Controlled among others by you, Mark, and Kenny. Tim was basically told that he is the employer himself and should have full control over his career and his business. However, this was mediated through lawyers, business managers, and others in the company. What was apparently forgotten was the question of whether Tim even has the necessary maturity to take on this role, and whether that actually leads to something better. Looking back today, the next stage of chaos seems to have begun at the exact moment when I was pushed out of the system by the very people you now want to separate yourself from. Pushed out. These actions have created a groundless mistrust toward me that persists to this day, even though it's constantly being disproven. Naturally, my relationship with Tim and my influence on him have suffered greatly as a result. And he is now firmly convinced that he's the one in the driver's seat and everyone else is replaceable. I only seem to be someone who's called in at the last minute when something goes wrong, as a kind of person in charge who's supposed to solve the problems. Regardless of why or in what context they came about, for the most part, control has been taken away from me. And now I am expected to clean up the mess, without everyone else even having seriously tried to do their part. This manifests itself in the fact that they insist that I leave my family for weeks at a time, fly to Los Angeles, and act as a babysitter for a 25-year-old man without any understanding or empathy for me, my family, or my business. His behavior over the last few months, if not even years, gives me very clear indications of exactly that, in case it was ever unclear before. I would have wished, just like you, for things like Tim understanding all of this and now truly having the will to pull himself together and come to Sweden to meet with me and everyone else who needs to help here. While we are at it with wishing for things, I would have also wished that everyone in his family would take a minimum level of responsibility and take a stand with him, simply for the reason that you are his family. That his mother gets more involved, since Tim is probably one of the most important parts of every family member's life. that you do not give up before actual progress and a realistic future can be seen. And that Tim pulls himself together and behaves like a normal, grateful human being who understands what position he is in and who made all of this possible in the first place. You cannot ask me for occasional interventions without there being a clear plan in place. At the moment, I do not even have full insight, but only receive information sporadically and selectively. It is decided which information I receive and which I do not, which makes it impossible for me to make informed decisions or have constructive conversations with Tim from either a business or personal perspective. It is an impossible task, which is further complicated by poor communication. I am absolutely ready to go anywhere in the world to help Tim. And I have shown multiple times that I will do everything to help him, even if it came at the cost of everything I have, what I stand for, and what matters to me. But for that, I either have to regain control over the situation, or there must be a clear plan that everyone supports together, and one that I can also stand behind. I cannot help him in any meaningful way if everyone isn't pulling in the same direction at the same time. I am someone who doesn't give up. But how am I supposed to fight for someone who doesn't want to win themselves while others just stand by and watch? I am not his father. I am his friend, his manager, and his business partner. And there are limits to how much I can force him on my own. Sincerely, Pournouri. Reading further into the documents, it becomes clear that the situation is not just coming to a head, but has been escalating for quite some time. A few weeks earlier, Tim had unfortunately consumed an excessive amount of alcohol and medication, so much so that he had to have his stomach pumped in the hospital. It is not the first incident. A pattern runs through his career over the course of several years. Gigs are booked and then cancelled at short notice, sometimes with visible problems. At one performance, he is so heavily intoxicated that the audience boos him. The performance starts off well, but he drinks a lot. You can tell during the set that he's been drinking. He accidentally turns off the music several times. In the last 20 minutes, he turns toward the backstage area so often that the audience starts booing. The boos get louder, and many people give him the finger. And yet, for a long time, he doesn't see a problem himself. We've already confronted him a dozen times about it, but Tim doesn't understand. And above all, he doesn't want to understand the gravity of the situation or the problem. We showed him videos where he is completely dazed from marijuana, and he just says that he was only tired. That's sick. On the contrary. While discussions are going on in the background between management and family about how to handle the situation, he publicly announces new ideas, new projects, new plans, two realities existing in parallel. In his private life too, the situation is coming to a head. His girlfriend leaves him, not for any single reason, but because she realizes she can't help him and that she's starting to suffer from it herself. At the same time, conflicts in his circle are intensifying. His father believes that work must continue at a steady pace, and that management, especially Ash, is responsible for that. When it comes to work, gigs, and so on, you're the most important person, especially in this situation. Tim respects you, and I believe that you're the only one who can create a positive kind of pressure, and that's exactly what we need. Management, on the other hand, comes to a different conclusion. that it's not actually a problem with the work itself, but rather it's more of a personal problem, one that can't simply be solved with more structure or with additional planning, but perhaps only through taking a break and an intervention. Pressure is also mounting from the outside. The then CEO of Universal Music Sweden, Per Sundin, is becoming increasingly impatient. He sets a clear deadline for the album, a deadline that is not being met. At the same time, Tim's father withdraws funding for management because there's no long-term plan. Management argues, however, that planning is hardly possible when agreements aren't kept and decisions keep changing. And so the summer of 2015 turns into an increasingly difficult period. In the official biography, a scene is described that summarizes this situation in a simple way. When Tim finally fell asleep, the others would roll their eyes and signal each other to be quiet so that he wouldn't wake up again. A small detail, but one that says a lot about the state of things at that time. Economically, too, this will not be without consequences. Partners are losing trust, and the entire system is coming under increasing pressure. In the end, management and family make a joint decision. They intervene. I think these consequences and measures will really help him realize how serious the situation is. It's a risk for everyone involved, but it seems to be a risk worth taking. It will make it clear to him that it's true care and true friendship when you confront him in this way. And I myself am ready to tell him that I'll step down as his manager if he doesn't do anything to get well. Ask everyone to think of 2 specific situations where Tim's behavior has affected them. With the date and the situation, especially if it was risky or dangerous and they were worried. The more specific, the better. Thanks, John. I think we can get 2 close friends. His dad, myself, Curly, Semi, Panos, and Carl together. Then we'll have the core group on site. After a performance at Ushuaia in Ibiza, Tim is confronted with the situation. Ash was the first to speak. We're here because we're worried about you. And we've asked John to oversee the whole thing. Tim's facial expression changed. Wait a minute, he said. Is this an intervention? John tried to sound as calm and confident as possible. Yes, Tim, this is an intervention. We're doing this out of love and care. Hopefully you'll realize that. Long conversations, discussions, resistance, and finally agreement follow. While still in Ibiza, he enters a rehab clinic, and there something decisive happens. For the first time, he begins to see himself differently. Not as someone who's just under pressure, but as someone who has a problem and has to deal with it. During his time at the clinic, he writes a lengthy text. A text in which he tries to understand himself. And that's exactly where a new chapter begins.